rain had a way of softening even the sharpest edges of the city. The sidewalks gleamed like sheets of polished obsidian, and street lamps cast their halos in warm amber pools that shimmered in every puddle. As dusk settled, the windows of a corner cafe glowed with honeyed light, turning the interior into a refuge from the chill outside. The glass was fogged at the edges where warmth met the night's cold breath, blurring the outlines of figures who lingered inside. From the street it looked almost like a painting, strokes of gold and umber, a gentle murmur of life wrapped in a frame of rain. Within, the cafe carried its own music, spoons clinking against porcelain muffled laughter, the steady hiss of the espresso machine as milk frothed and steamed. It was intimate without being quiet, lively without being loud, a place where strangers could share the same air without demanding anything of one another. Yet in the far corner, beneath a framed print of an old harbor, sat a woman who seemed utterly detached from the warm hum around her, Isabella Morrison. To most, her name summoned an image as rigid and precise as the navy blazer she wore. She was the CEO who entered conference rooms like a storm contained in silk. Negotiations bent beneath her will. Rivals, men twice her size with decades of experience, found themselves retreating when her dark eyes fixed on them with unwavering command. They called her the Steel Executive, a title that clung to her in every magazine profile and investor newsletter. She embodied efficiency, power, control. Nothing ever rattled her. Nothing except the little girl seated across from her. Isabella's hand rested on a ceramic cup, its once hot contents long since surrendered to the cold. She didn't drink, didn't even seem to notice, but her fingers clutched at the porcelain as though it might tether her to something she couldn't name. She glanced across the table at the child. 9 years old, hair a tumble of chestnut curls, gaze fixed on the rain trickling down the glass. Emma. Here. The steel dissolved. No quarterly report, no hostile takeover, no battle with the press had ever undone Isabella the way her daughter's silence did. Emma had been born without a voice, her world quiet where others were filled with sound. She had never said mama, never laughed out loud in the way children often did, bubbling over with unrestrained joy. Isabella had chased solutions with the same ferocity she once brought to corporate deals. Specialists, therapists, educators, every expert she could find. All of them had left with the same regret in their eyes. We're sorry. There's nothing more we can do. So Isabella tried to fill the silence herself. She bought the best toys, the best tutors, carved hours out of her relentless schedule to be present. Yet when she sat across from her daughter as she did now, she felt the same suffocating truth. Emma was still unreachable. The language she spoke, through gestures, scribbles, fleeting expressions, remained a puzzle Isabella could never quite solve. Outside the window, autumn leaves broke free from their branches and spiraled across the street in flashes of gold and rust. Inside, Isabella forced a smile, hoping the curve of her lips could bridge the distance between them. Emma did not notice. Her eyes tracked the falling leaves, her expression wistful, almost solemn, as if she alone knew some secret the rest of the world could never hear. For the first time all day, Isabella allowed herself to exhale, the sound nearly lost beneath the cafe's chatter. She had conquered so much in her life, markets, mergers, reputations, but here, in this quiet corner, she was utterly powerless. The steel that had once seemed impenetrable now felt paper-thin, and as she swirled her untouched drink, watching the steam fade into nothing, the thought pressed against her with unbearable weight. Her greatest failure wasn't in business. It was here, across from her child in the silence she could not break. The rain pressed harder against the cafe windows, blurring the outside world until it was nothing more than streaks of liquid light. Inside, the golden glow of the hanging lamp seemed to pool around each table, illuminating strangers who laughed, worked, or leaned close to share secrets. Yet at the booth in the far corner, silence ruled like an invisible monarch. Emma sat small and still across from her mother, hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the glass pane streaked with rivulets of water. 9 years old. Yet her eyes carried a gravity that unsettled even the most casual observer. They were knowing eyes, watchful eyes, as if she were forever translating the world in ways no one else could. She was a child shaped not by sound but by absence, molded by silence so complete that it had become part of her essence. To the outside world, Emma might have seemed delicate, fragile, even breakable. But Isabella knew better. Beneath the surface lay a resilience that startled her at times, a fierce persistence in the way Emma scribbled notes when words failed, or the stubborn tilt of her chin when adults underestimated her. Still, resilience was not the same as connection, and that was what gnawed at Isabella now, the same gnawing ache that woke her in the middle of countless nights. The silence between them wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, charged, a presence in itself. Isabella had spent fortunes on specialists, speech pathologists, audiologists, educators, all of them parading through Emma's life with glossy promises. And one by one they had left with the same verdict cloaked in professional sympathy. There is little more we can do. Each failed attempt left a fracture in Isabella's armor, though she would never admit it aloud. She had once believed there was no problem she couldn't solve. In the world of hostile takeovers and billion-dollar contracts, her word was final, her judgment flawless. Yet here was a puzzle that resisted every effort, a riddle that refused to yield. Her daughter's silence was not something to conquer. It was a wall, and Isabella stood powerless at its base. Emma shifted slightly, her small fingers tapping against the wooden table in a rhythm. Only she seemed to understand. Tap, pause, tap, tap. Isabella watched, trying to decipher whether it was habit, a code, or perhaps some hidden attempt at communication. The rhythm reminded her of Morse code, dots and dashes, messages waiting to be translated. But she could not unlock it, and the not knowing made her feel the familiar sting of inadequacy. Emma, Isabella said softly, though the girl could not hear her. The name felt strange on her tongue, too rarely spoken aloud. She forced a smile, though it felt brittle. Emma didn't turn, didn't acknowledge. Her eyes remained fastened on the storm-smeared glass where the distorted silhouettes of strangers hurried by. For a fleeting second, Isabella thought she saw something shift in her daughter's reflection. A flicker of expression, almost longing, almost recognition, as if Emma saw a world beyond the window that Isabella herself could never reach. It unsettled her. She wondered, not for the first time, what vast inner universe lived behind those solemn eyes. What thoughts Emma carried but could never release. And beneath that thought lurked a darker one. What if Emma never lets me in? What if my own child grows up believing I never truly saw her? The weight of it pressed harder than the rain against the glass. Isabella lowered her gaze to her coffee cup, now stone cold in her hands, and tried to steady her breathing. A woman who had stared down Fortune 500 rivals without flinching, now sat trembling at the quiet defiance of her own daughter's silence. Then, just as Isabella reached for her phone, a nervous habit, an escape into emails and numbers she could control, Emma moved. Slowly, deliberately, the girl lifted her hands and began shaping them into small halting signs. Not the ones Isabella half knew from the pamphlets and rushed lessons with exhausted tutors. No, these were different, smoother, faster, more natural. For a moment, Isabella's heart leapt. Was Emma trying to speak to her? Was this the breakthrough she had prayed for? She leaned forward, desperate to catch every flick of her daughter's fingers, but the motions ended as quickly as they had begun. Emma dropped her hands, her face shuddering, and looked back toward the rain as if nothing had happened. A knot twisted in Isabella's chest. What had Emma tried to say? Why stop? And why now in this cafe of all places? The silence returned, heavier than before. Isabella pressed her palm flat to the table, trying to ground herself, but unease prickled through her. Something was shifting, though she couldn't name it. It was as if the air itself had thickened with expectation, as if some unseen thread had been pulled taut, waiting for the moment it would snap or unravel into something entirely new. And though she didn't yet know it, the moment that would change everything was only minutes away. The chime above the cafe door broke the rhythm of the evening. A single bright note threaded its way through the steady percussion of rain, carrying with it a crisp breath of autumn. For a moment the cafe seemed to pause. Steam hung in the air, a spoon stilled mid-stir. A burst of laughter trailed off into silence. Then life resumed, but Isabella felt it. A ripple, a disturbance subtle but undeniable, as though someone had walked in carrying the weight of a story the room wasn't yet ready to hear. The man who entered wasn't remarkable at first glance. His clothes were unassuming, a worn leather jacket faded at the seams layered over a charcoal pullover. His boots tracked in a trace of wet pavement. Yet there was something about the way he carried himself, a kind of quiet gravity, as though he'd been forged in storms harsher than this one and learned to endure them without fanfare. His hair, unruly and damp from the weather, caught the golden light from above and turned it into a kind of accidental halo. Isabella barely looked up. Her mind was still tethered to her daughter's aborted attempt at signing, still haunted by the message she could not decipher. She noticed the stranger only in passing, the kind of glance you give another presence in the room before turning inward again. But Emma noticed. Her eyes, once fixed on the storm outside, flickered toward him with a spark of awareness Isabella hadn't seen before. The man approached the counter, his voice low as he placed his order. Isabella caught fragments of it, the timbre warm, steady, carrying none of the brittle edges she so often encountered in the men of her world. He lingered only long enough to retrieve his drink, then turned. His eyes swept the cafe, not in search of anything in particular, but in that way travelers glance around, absorbing spaces like maps. When they landed on the empty chair beside Isabella and Emma's booth, he hesitated. It was a polite pause, as though he didn't want to intrude. Then, with a small incline of his head, he stepped forward. "Excuse me," he said gently, his words careful, unobtrusive. "Would you mind if I sit here? The other tables seem full." Isabella glanced up, distracted, her mind still elsewhere. She gave a curt nod, the automatic kind of courtesy one extends without thinking. She didn't want company. Her world was already heavy enough with silence and guilt, yet the man's presence settled into the space beside them as naturally as if he'd belonged there all along. Emma studied him openly, her gaze steady but curious. It was unusual. She often shrank from strangers, retreating into her own cocoon of quiet. But now she seemed alert, waiting. Isabella noticed the shift but dismissed it, assuming it was nothing more than childish curiosity. The man set his steaming cup on the table, pulled out a small battered leather journal from his satchel, and flipped it open. For several minutes nothing remarkable happened. He sipped his drink, occasionally glanced out the window at the rain and made a few notes in his journal. He didn't attempt conversation. He didn't intrude. The three of them sat in a kind of shared silence, two worlds parallel, separated by an invisible wall. And then it happened. The man paused mid-thought, his gaze drifting toward Emma. His expression softened, not with pity but with recognition, an unspoken acknowledgement, as though he saw something others often overlooked. Slowly he set his pen down, lifted his hands and began to move them in deliberate, practiced shapes. At first, Isabella dismissed it as idle fidgeting. Maybe he was stretching his fingers, distracted by some private thought. But then she caught the rhythm, the clarity of the movements, the unmistakable intention in the way his hands carved words out of the air. And Emma, her Emma, transformed. Her face lit up as though someone had pulled back a veil. Her posture straightened, her eyes widened, and in an instant she was alive in a way Isabella had not seen in years. Her small hands lifted, hesitant at first, then responding with a fluency that startled Isabella. It was no mimicry. It was conversation. Real conversation. Isabella froze. Her pulse stumbled, her breath caught in her throat. She watched, disbelieving, as her daughter's silence, her lifelong silence, was filled, not with sound but with meaning. Emma's hands moved quickly now, bold, assured, her face breaking into an unguarded smile that stole the air from Isabella's lungs. And then laughter. Not the stilted imitation of laughter Emma sometimes offered, but a soundless burst of joy that shone from her eyes, radiant and pure. The stranger signed again, his hands flowing like poetry, his movements both tender and precise. Emma mirrored him, answering eagerly, her entire being transformed by the dialogue unfolding between them. Time in the cafe seemed to dissolve. The clinking cups, the hum of conversation, the hiss of steaming milk, all of it fell away until there was only this, a girl who had been voiceless her entire life, and a man who had just given her a language she could soar in. Isabella sat motionless, trembling, as the truth pressed down on her like a revelation. A stranger had done in minutes what she, with all her power and resources, had failed to do in 9 long years, and she was terrified to know why. For a moment, Isabella thought her senses were betraying her. The man's fingers moved too fluidly, too intentionally to be dismissed as nervous fidgeting. Each gesture carried rhythm, each shape a precision she recognized only in fragments from the countless pamphlets and clumsy lessons she had half forced herself through. But this was different. This wasn't study. This was fluency. Emma's reaction confirmed it. The girl had straightened so suddenly that her curls tumbled over her shoulders, her eyes igniting with something Isabella hadn't seen in years. Spark, recognition, belonging. It wasn't just interest. It was connection. The kind of connection Isabella herself had tried and failed to forge. No matter how many experts she hired or how many late nights she spent practicing symbols in front of her bathroom mirror until her hands cramped. Now, before her eyes, her daughter bloomed. Emma's small hands lifted, uncertain at first as though testing the reality of this miracle. Then, with growing confidence, she began to reply. Her fingers formed signs rapidly, fluidly, like water rushing over rocks. Words, real words, spilled from her hands, and though they carried no sound, they filled the space between her and this stranger with meaning so alive it was almost audible. And then came the sound Isabella had longed for, more than applause in any boardroom, more than victory in any negotiation. Laughter, not the careful, measured mimicry Emma sometimes offered when prompted, but laughter that burst unguarded from her chest, silent yet radiant. It was pure joy stripped of fear and self-consciousness. Isabella felt her throat tighten, her vision blur. She didn't move. She couldn't. She was afraid that if she did, the moment would shatter like glass. The man signed again, a smile tugging gently at his lips, his movements graceful, tender, like a conductor coaxing music from silence. Emma answered eagerly, her whole body leaning into the exchange. Their hands moved faster now, their silent dialogue weaving an invisible tapestry in the air, each sign a stitch binding them closer. Isabella sat paralyzed. Her daughter, who had spent 9 years encased in silence, who had been unreachable despite every effort, was laughing and conversing with a stranger. Her heart raced. Gratitude warred with jealousy. Wonder clashed with fear. Who was this man? Why did he know Emma's language when she herself did not? And why did Emma, so guarded with others, open so easily to him? The cafe seemed to fade. The chatter of customers blurred into static. The clinking cups dissolved into background noise. Time folded inward, trapping her in this moment, her child's joy blazing against the steel walls Isabella had built around herself. At last the man glanced toward her. His expression was kind, almost apologetic, as though he realized he had stepped across an invisible threshold. He raised his hands again, signing carefully, slowly, so she might understand. Isabella caught fragments. "Hello, I hope this is okay." Her lips parted. Words stuck in her throat. She shook her head, not in refusal, but in disbelief, her voice emerging hoarse. "No, it's more than okay." Her composure cracked. For years she had cultivated an image of control, a woman impervious to weakness. But here, across from her, was proof that her power meant nothing in the face of her daughter's silence, and nothing in the face of this stranger who had broken it so easily. Summoning courage she didn't feel, Isabella asked, "How do you know this? How do you sign?" The question hung in the air, heavy with suspicion and desperate hope. The stranger's gaze softened, and a shadow passed through his expression, a shadow of memory, grief, and something else Isabella couldn't yet name. His fingers curled lightly against the surface of his journal, as if grounding himself. When he spoke, his voice was low, steady, carrying a weight that silenced the space between them. "My boy," he said quietly. He couldn't hear. "We lost him 2 years ago, but I vowed to keep his language alive." The words struck Isabella like a current. Grief, loss, a vow born of love and pain. And suddenly she understood. This wasn't chance. This was something deeper, something larger than coincidence. A man who had lost his son, sitting across from a girl who had never had a voice, speaking to her in the language Isabella herself had failed to master. Her defenses faltered. The steel she had worn for decades bent beneath the weight of gratitude and sorrow. She opened her mouth to speak but found no words strong enough. Instead, her hand trembled against the surface of the table, as though her body itself betrayed what her pride could not confess. She was undone. Emma signed something swiftly, urgently. Isabella didn't understand, but the man did. He turned toward her, eyes shining, and whispered the translation like a gift placed in trembling hands. She said, "Thank you for seeing me. Isabella's breath hitched. In that moment, she realized the truth she had been running from all these years. Specialists had failed, therapists had failed, even she had failed. But this stranger had given her daughter the one thing she craved more than words, more than speech, more than anything else, to be seen. And Isabella knew, with terrifying clarity, that nothing in her carefully controlled life would ever be the same again. The cafe's warmth seemed to pulse differently now, as though the very air recognized the shift. What had been background noise, the clink of cups, the chatter of strangers, became distant, irrelevant. The real weight of the world was here, concentrated in the space between three people at a corner booth. Isabella Morrison, the steel executive, Emma, her silent daughter, suddenly radiant with life, and the stranger whose hands had bridged the unbridgeable David. His name had come softly, like an afterthought, when Isabella asked. But his story did not arrive so easily. It emerged slowly, cautiously, as though he were unspooling a thread that could snap under the wrong touch. "My boy," he began again, his gaze flickering toward Emma, then away. "His name was Daniel. He couldn't hear from the moment he was born." Isabella's breath caught. A son. The word carried 1,000 unspoken truths: love, responsibility, grief. Her fingers tightened around her cup, though the coffee inside had gone cold long ago. She said nothing, afraid to interrupt the current of his voice. David's eyes grew distant, glassed with memory. We learned sign language together, the two of us. His mother struggled with it, found it too difficult, too slow. But me, I made it our world. Every night I'd sign him stories until he fell asleep. Fairy tales, baseball games, bedtime prayers. It was our secret language, his gift to me, my promise to him. Emma watched him intently, her eyes wide and soft, as if absorbing every fragment of the man's truth. Isabella wanted to reach across the table, wanted to ask, wanted to say something, anything, but the words refused to form. She had no language for this. David's voice thickened. And then 2 years ago he got sick. Really sick. The kind of sick that doesn't give you time to prepare, doesn't give you warning. He was gone before I even knew how to imagine a world without him. His hands pressed flat to the table, steadying himself against the weight of the memory. But I kept signing. I couldn't stop. Because if I stopped, then his language would vanish, and I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let him vanish twice. The silence that followed was heavier than any Isabella had ever endured in a boardroom. Not hostile, not empty, but full, swollen with grief, compassion, and something dangerously close to hope. Emma shifted then, her small hand reaching across the space between them. Not for Isabella, for David. Her fingers brushed the back of his hand, tentative but deliberate. She signed something, quick, fluid. Isabella couldn't follow, but David's lips trembled as he read it. She said, he translated softly, "I wish I could have known him." Isabella's chest constricted, as if invisible hands had closed around her ribs. She had fought mergers, lawsuits, and crises that would have broken other leaders. She had outmaneuvered predators in Armani suits who'd tried to crush her. Yet she could barely breathe under the weight of her daughter's compassion for a man she'd only just met. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she forced them down. She wouldn't break here, not in front of a stranger. Yet something inside her whispered that perhaps it was already too late. David turned toward her then, his gaze steady. Not prying, but present. "You've been carrying this alone," he said quietly. "Haven't you?" The question cracked something in her she hadn't realized was brittle. For years, Isabella had worn her armor so tightly that even she had begun to believe in its invincibility. But now, here in a cafe with her daughter laughing silently beside a grieving stranger, she could feel the fissures widening. Her voice came rough, uneven. "I've tried everything. Specialists, schools, tutors. I've spent more money than I can admit chasing every cure, every method, every promise." Her hand trembled as she dragged it through her hair, and nothing worked. Nothing. "She is still silent. And she faltered, her throat burning. "I don't know how to be her mother." The admission hung in the air like a confession. The woman who had conquered empires, who had earned the nickname Steel Executive, was admitting defeat. Not in business, but in the one place it mattered most. David did not recoil. He did not pity her. He simply listened, his silence an anchor rather than a void. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of a man who knew grief, who knew the futility of control. "You're wrong," he said gently. She doesn't need you to fix her. She needs you to see her, to meet her where she is, that's all. Isabella blinked hard, but the tears spilled anyway, streaking silently down her face. Emma reached for her hand then, her fingers warm and small against Isabella's trembling grip. The child signed something, slowly, deliberately this time, so her mother might have a chance to understand. Isabella caught only fragments. But she caught enough. I love you. Her breath fractured. She bowed her head, pressing Emma's hand to her lips, sobbing soundlessly as the cafe carried on around them, oblivious to the miracle unfolding in its corner. And for the first time in her life, Isabella Morrison, the woman made of steel, allowed herself to break. The boardroom had always been her battlefield. There Isabella Morrison thrived, every glance, every pause, every calculated silence another weapon in her arsenal. She could read fear in the twitch of a rival's jaw, predict surrender in the slump of a competitor's shoulders. She had learned that silence could be power, that control was survival. But in her penthouse that night, silence became unbearable. Emma slept curled beneath her blanket, her chestnut curls spilling across the pillow like soft ink strokes, her small fingers twitching faintly as though she were still signing in dreams. Isabella lingered by the doorway, her shadow stretching across the carpet. For years she had looked at her daughter and seen an impenetrable wall, a puzzle she could not solve, a silence she could not master. Tonight, after David's confession and Emma's laughter, the wall had cracked, and for the first time, Isabella was afraid of herself. She moved to the desk by the window, her fortress of contracts and reports stacked neatly beside the glow of her laptop. But the words on the screen blurred. Spreadsheets, deadlines, mergers, none of it mattered. Her fingers itched for something else, something unfamiliar. She closed the laptop and reached instead for the notepad she had used earlier at the cafe. On it she scrawled 3 letters, ASL. Her pen hovered there, trembling. She had tried before, yes. Tutors, apps, expensive consultants flown in from across the country. But she had approached sign language the same way she approached a takeover, efficient, aggressive, determined to conquer. And each attempt had failed because she had treated it as a business strategy rather than a lifeline. Tonight was different. Tonight it was not about conquering. Tonight it was about surrender. She opened a video tutorial on her phone. The speaker's hands moved slowly, deliberately forming shapes that felt at once alien and intimate. Isabella mimicked them, her gestures sharp and awkward at first, her movements betraying her fear of failure. She repeated the signs until her wrists ached. Then she tried again. And again hours passed. The city outside shifted from midnight stillness to the muted hum of dawn. When Emma awoke and padded into the living room in her socks, she found her mother hunched over the kitchen counter, her blazer discarded, hair unkempt, eyes red from exhaustion. Isabella looked up and without speaking she raised her hands, clumsy, hesitant, imperfect but unmistakable. Good morning. Emma froze. Her gaze darted between her mother's hands and her mother's face, as though she needed to confirm that she hadn't dreamed it. Then slowly, her lips parted in a silent laugh, and her small hands lifted in reply. Good morning, Mama. The fortress cracked wider. From that morning on, Isabella's life shifted. Deals still demanded her attention, her name still carried power, but she carved time from the iron walls of her schedule. Board meetings ended, and instead of retreating into strategy papers, she locked her office door and practiced signing in front of a mirror. On flights between cities, she filled her notebooks not with financial forecasts, but with handshapes and phrases. At home, Emma became her teacher, giggling, correcting, coaxing her into fluency with patience that humbled the woman once known for impatience. The progress was slow, sometimes humiliating. Isabella's hands stumbled over shapes, her fingers stiff, her gestures awkward. But each mistake drew not frustration from Emma, but joy, because for the first time her mother wasn't merely watching her, but joining her. And then, one evening weeks later, the miracle happened. They sat at the dining table. Half-finished plates forgotten, homework spread in uneven piles. Isabella signed a simple phrase, one she had practiced for days but never dared to attempt before. I am proud of you. Emma froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. Then her eyes shimmered with tears too big for a child her age. Her hands moved quickly, clumsily, mirroring her mother's effort. I am proud of you too. Isabella's chest tightened. She had been praised by presidents of corporations, applauded by shareholders, feared by rivals. None of it compared to this. But with the breakthrough came fear, because David remained in the shadows of her thoughts. His story haunted her, the father who had lost a son but kept his language alive. Isabella could not decide what unsettled her more, the gratitude she felt toward him, or the way her daughter lit up in his presence, as though he had unlocked something Isabella herself had never found. What if Emma needed him more than she needed her? What if all of Isabella's power, all of her late-night studying, all of her desperate attempts could never compare to the natural fluency he carried from his son's memory? And deeper still, another fear she dared not name. What if she herself needed him? That night, as she tucked Emma into bed, Emma signed something new. Something Isabella had not yet learned. She stumbled, confused, and Emma giggled before slowly repeating the signs. Isabella pieced them together with the help of her notebook later. The translation sent a chill down her spine. When we see David again? The fortress crumbled further. Isabella lay awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling, realizing that her carefully ordered world was tilting toward something she could not control. She had built her empire on control, and now, for the first time, she wondered if surrendering it might be the only way to save not just her daughter, but herself. The air carried the bite of winter, sharp enough to sting the skin. The city was strung with lights, storefronts glowing in festive colors that blurred against the slick pavement. Isabella walked with Emma down the crowded street, her daughter's mittened hand snug in her own. The girl's curls bounced as she skipped along, signing excitedly about every flickering decoration they passed. Isabella replied haltingly, her fingers still stiff with practice, but Emma's face glowed anyway. Each time her mother fumbled, she waited patiently, giggling when the correction clicked. For the first time in years, their walks were not silent corridors of longing. They were conversations, vibrant even without sound. But beneath Isabella's practiced gestures, her mind churned. She knew what Emma wanted. The question had hovered between them ever since that night at the cafe. When do we see David again? Isabella had delayed, had diverted, had drowned herself in work and practice to avoid the inevitable. Yet Emma's longing was clear, her gaze lifting at every cafe they passed, searching. Isabella could deny mergers, crush competitors, silence entire boardrooms, but she could not deny her daughter's hope. So tonight, she relented. They walked not toward home, but toward the corner cafe where everything had begun. The bell above the door chimed as they entered, releasing the warm scent of espresso and baked bread. The place was alive with quiet chatter, students bent over laptops, couples curled into booths. And there, in the same seat where fate had once placed him, sat David, his leather jacket draped over the chair, his journal open, a steaming cup untouched at his side. Emma spotted him first. Her whole face lit up and she bolted forward before Isabella could stop her. She flung her arms around David's waist, startling him into laughter, and immediately began signing, her hands fluttering with excitement. David responded easily, his gestures fluid, his smile soft. For a moment, Isabella simply stood in the doorway, watching her daughter glow with a joy that seemed to reach deeper than anything she had ever given her. And beneath that joy, jealousy stirred. She pushed it down and moved to join them. David looked up, his eyes meeting hers with warmth tinged by something heavier. A sadness, maybe, or a secret. They sat together, Emma bouncing between them like a bridge. For a time, conversation flowed in signs and fragments of spoken words. Isabella stumbled through sentences, David guiding her patiently, Emma giggling at her mistakes. The laughter loosened Isabella's chest, but the unease never left her. Finally, when Emma left the table to fetch a napkin, David's expression shifted. His smile faded, replaced by a gravity that made Isabella's pulse quicken. "There's something I haven't told you," he said quietly. Her breath stilled. She had known this moment would come, though she hadn't known what shape it would take. David's hands rested on the journal. He hesitated, then opened it, revealing not words but sketches, pages upon pages of drawings. A little boy with dark curls and wide eyes, hands frozen mid-sign, scenes of a hospital room, a small bed, a child reaching out with frail fingers. The images were raw, urgent, aching. "This was Daniel," David murmured. "My son, Isabella's throat tightened. She traced the lines of the sketches with her eyes, unable to look away. Daniel's face radiated life even in stillness. A boy she had never met yet somehow felt she knew. David inhaled deeply as if steadying himself against a storm. There's more. Daniel's mother. She worked in finance, a rising star, brilliant, ruthless, the kind who built empires while the rest of us scrambled to catch up. He lifted his gaze and the weight of it struck her like a blow. Her name was Morrison. Isabella froze. The cafe's hum receded, her body rigid, her mind scrambling. No, she whispered, her voice brittle. That's not possible. David's expression softened with sorrow. She was your sister, Isabella. The world tilted. Isabella's stomach lurched, her vision blurring. She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. Memories flickered, fragments of a childhood estranged, a sister she had severed ties with years ago, dismissing her as reckless, as weak. They had not spoken in over a decade. She had told herself the chapter was closed, but the boy she had never known existed. Daniel, her nephew. Emma returned then, clutching a napkin, oblivious to the storm. She slid back into the booth, her bright eyes darting between them. What's wrong? Her hands asked in fluid movements Isabella only half understood. David translated softly. We're just remembering someone important. Emma tilted her head, her curls brushing her cheek. Then she signed something, slow, deliberate, like a prayer. Family. Isabella's chest fractured. She reached for her daughter, pulling her close, pressing her cheek to her curls. Her tears spilled freely now, not just for the years of silence between her and Emma, but for the years of silence between her and her sister. For the nephew she had lost before she even knew his name. David closed the journal gently. Maybe, he said softly, this isn't about fixing what's broken. Maybe it's about building what's left. The words hung there, heavy with truth. For the first time, Isabella saw her life not as a fortress to defend, but as a bridge still waiting to be built. And sitting across from her was a man who had carried her family's grief. Her daughter who had carried her forgiveness and the chance, fragile, terrifying, miraculous, to finally belong. The steel executive was gone. What remained was a woman, trembling, broken, but alive. And for the first time she dared to believe that was enough.